Dusk had given way to night, and a dense darkness covered the isolated roads that cut through the countryside. Liam was used to these solitary journeys, where his only companions were the soft hum of the engine and the intermittent dance of headlights illuminating the road ahead. He was a middle-aged man, his face marked by time, his hand steady on the wheel, his gaze tired but alert. That night, he was transporting an unusual load, to say the least. He had received the job with few explanations and one clear instruction, printed in red letters on the contract. Do not open the trailer under any circumstances. It was the kind of guideline he generally didn't question. The less he knew about what he was transporting, the easier it was to complete the task without complications. But that night an unsettling curiosity gnawed at him. The cargo had been sealed at the terminal, a large metal container with a rusty tone and a look that seemed lived in. It was heavy, heavier than usual, and he could feel the trailer's extra weight on the truck's traction as he accelerated. Something about that box made his senses scream to keep a distance, but he brushed off the discomfort with a sigh, convincing himself it was just another job. As he drove, Liam began to notice the nearly absolute emptiness of the road. There were no distant lights from houses, nor any sign of a nearby town. Just him, the truck, and the weight of that load that seemed to almost crush the asphalt under his tires. The silence in the cab and the muffled rumble of the engine only reinforced the loneliness of the journey. After a few hours, he noticed his mind was wandering, trapped in speculation about what might be back there. Documents, equipment. And why did the cargo need to be taken to such an isolated town without him being allowed to open the compartment? He forced himself to divert his thoughts, keeping his eyes firmly on the dark road ahead. Then, as if to break his reverie, the truck's static-filled radio crackled briefly, emitting an almost supernatural pop. He cast a quick glance at the device, waiting for the silence to return, which it did shortly after. But in that instant he felt a strange chill run up his spine, as if the truck itself were sending him a warning signal. He accelerated a little, trying to dispel the feeling of unease, but he couldn't shake off a thought that kept pounding in his mind. Something about that cargo didn't feel right. The night crept forward slowly, with the hours dragging by at an almost unbearable pace. The road stretched endlessly ahead, wrapped in the thick darkness of forests rising on both sides. Liam continued onward, his attention split between the dark asphalt in front of him and the increasingly strange weight he felt emanating from the trailer. As he drove, something changed. He heard a low, muffled sound. At first he thought it was just the truck rumbling over an uneven patch of road, but the noise persisted, a soft, almost rhythmic thudding, as if something was trying to get out. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road and pressing the accelerator a little harder, yet the sound didn't fade. With every mile, the thudding seemed to grow louder. The noise merged with the engine's hum, creating a disturbing echo that reverberated through the cab. He cast a quick glance in the rearview mirror, as though he could see through the metal walls and identify what was causing that insistent noise. But of course, all he saw was the solid darkness of the trailer. Liam let out a nervous laugh, trying to convince himself that his mind was playing tricks on him. How many times had he dealt with cargoes that seemed to exude mystery? It was just another job. A night delivery with an unusual load. That's what he kept telling himself. But with every mile, that small voice of doubt whispered in his mind, feeding his suspicion. Then a figure appeared by the side of the road, a shadowy shape, as though someone were waiting there on the shoulder. Liam's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't explain why, but the unexpected presence of that lone figure in the middle of nowhere seemed to intensify the fear that had already begun to creep over him. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, passing the shadow without glancing away, yet couldn't resist a final glance in the rear-view mirror. Nothing, just the emptiness of the road. Sweat trickled down his forehead, despite the early morning chill. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and tried to focus, but the sound of pounding was louder now, a low, cadenced rhythm that seemed to pulse within the trailer's walls. It was as if it were alive. The dread rose, suffocating him as he tried in vain to push away the thought that something within that load was far from just ordinary cargo. Then, the radio crackled again, a sharp, piercing static that broke the silence. For a moment, he almost expected to hear a voice come through, but the static quickly faded, leaving an even heavier stillness behind. He wondered if he should pull over, check the cargo perhaps, but the idea felt wrong. Instinctively, he knew that stopping right now wouldn't be safe. Liam shifted in his seat, taking a deep breath, and kept driving forward, the sound of the pounding echoing in his mind, and the unsettling feeling that somewhere along this road, an unseen presence was waiting for him. The road twisted through the dense forest, and Liam could no longer be certain of how long he had been driving. Hours blurred together, and exhaustion weighed on him. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the sound from the trailer didn't stop. On the contrary, it seemed to grow stronger, like an insidious presence pounding from within. The pounding had transformed into something else, something that resembled a desperate scratching. Now and then, a low creak echoed, as though something inside shifted, pressing against the metal walls. Liam could no longer ignore it. The instinct to avoid the unknown clashed with the need to understand what he was transporting. He pulled the truck over on the deserted roadside, the engine idling, casting shifting shadows in the glow of the headlights. He cut the engine, and silence fell with an almost supernatural depth. The sound in the trailer stopped immediately, as if it had sensed he had come to a halt. Liam stood frozen, his body gripped by the dread of discovering what awaited him behind those heavy doors. But the silence was short-lived. A new sound echoed from inside the trailer, this time louder and closer, like a violent punch against the metal wall. He instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding. Whoever or whatever was inside seemed to know he was just outside, listening. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, trying to recall the contact number the company had provided. Before he could dial, he heard a strange noise, something that sounded like breathing. It was hard to tell for sure, but the sound came from the trailer, muffled and heavy, as though some creature inside were struggling to catch its breath between the pounding. Liam's hand hovered over the phone, his thumb poised on the call button. But then something even more disturbing happened. A low, raspy voice whispered his name. Not clearly, but enough to freeze his blood. It seemed impossible, perhaps a hallucination, but the feeling that something inside knew who he was left him paralyzed. Overwhelmed by panic, he climbed back into the truck and turned the key with trembling hands. The engine roared to life and he accelerated, deciding that his only option was to keep going. The pounding resumed, persistent and rhythmic, louder now, as though his departure had triggered a desperate reaction from whatever was inside. It was as if he were being watched, as if something within the trailer was studying him, testing his resolve. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he kept his eyes on the road. The noise in the trailer became more insistent, the pounding quicker, like a plea or a threat. A horrible thought crossed his mind. The thing in the trailer was alive, and worse, it wanted out. He drove faster, trying to outrun the feeling that he was transporting something that didn't belong to this world, something that was waiting for the right moment to break free. The deserted road stretched out ahead, illuminated only by the headlights slicing through the night's black void. Liam took deep breaths, trying to regain control, but the feeling of being watched weighed on him like a suffocating blanket. The pounding in the trailer continued, louder now, joined by a sharp, metallic wail, a twisted groan as if something was trapped between the steel walls and the empty darkness. He turned on the radio, hoping for some noise to drown out that unbearable sound. But instead of music or static, he heard a rough crackling, followed by a sound that shouldn't have been there. A voice distant, faint whispered something. He shut off the radio immediately, but the sound persisted, a disturbing murmur seeping directly into the cab, or perhaps some shadowed corner of his mind. Liam, the voice whispered almost like a taunt. He froze, his blood turning to ice. It was impossible, utterly irrational, yet he couldn't shake the certainty that someone was aware of his presence. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white from the pressure. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before him, offering no escape. Suddenly a thought crept into his mind. What if he stopped and checked the cargo once and for all? This constant torment had already consumed him. Running was no longer an option. Summoning his courage, he steered the truck to the side of the road, turned off the engine and climbed out. The night air was frigid, dense with a clammy dampness that made him shiver. As he approached the trailer, the noises ceased completely, leaving only a silence that was somehow even more menacing. His hand shook as he slid the key into the padlock, fighting the feeling that he was about to release something that should not exist. Finally, with a heavy creak, he pulled open the doors. At first, he saw only dense shadows and stacked crates, like any other load. But as his eyes adjusted, he detected movement, a faint swaying deep in the back. Breathing deeply, he stepped into the trailer, his footsteps echoing in the confined space until he reached a large metal crate, the source of the oppressive presence and muffled sound. He stopped in front of it, and before he could react, a powerful impact from inside made it vibrate, as if some caged animal were trying to break free. Heart pounding, he took a step back, but then that same raspy voice, the one he'd heard on the radio, whispered again, closer this time. Liam, you come me. The shock paralyzed him. He stared at the crate, breath shallow, realizing something had changed. It was as if the cargo had morphed into a sentient being, a hungry entity that had just recognized him. His legs trembled, and the only thought that flashed through his mind was that somehow this thing knew him. Backing slowly toward the trailer doors, he heard the scratching resume, frantic, and a low, sinister laugh echoed in his mind. He slammed the doors shut, heart hammering in his chest, and raced back to the cab. He didn't know what was inside that cargo, but one thing was certain, it wasn't from this world. Liam climbed back into the cab, locking the door with a sharp click, as if that small act alone could keep him safe. He tried to control his breathing, which came in shallow gasps, each one tinged with the edge of panic. For a fleeting moment, silence fell over the deserted road. He started the engine and glanced into the rearview mirror, struggling to block out the memory of what he'd just seen and heard. But it was no use. The engine's steady hum, which had once been a comforting presence, now felt fragile, distant. He tried to rationalize it all. Maybe it was some twisted prank by the loader, or perhaps a defect in the cargo straps. But every excuse he conjured vanished the moment he remembered the voice, and how it had called him by name. As he focused on the road, a new sound filled the air. This time it wasn't just a distant whisper or an isolated scratch. It was something far worse. A rhythmic pounding coming from the trailer, steady and relentless, like a drum beating from within. Each thud grew louder than the last, reverberating through the pedals beneath his feet. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, running a hand across his sweaty face. He stared at the road, but the relentless rhythm in the back made him feel as if something invisible was trying to breach the cab. Each knock carried a mounting sense of dread, as though the very weight of the cargo grew heavier, denser with every passing mile. Panic began to consume him. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, cold sweat trickling down his forehead. He knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't keep driving down this deserted road with something so alive trapped in his truck. But where would he go? The destination was hours away, and each minute drew him deeper into the night, closer to whatever awaited him. Suddenly he heard it again, the voice. This time it was clearer and carried an unsettling familiarity, as if it knew every intimate detail of his life. "Liam, you can't leave me, Hiri." The voice was slow, almost gentle, yet laced with something that sent chills deep into his bones. He felt a shiver, as if an invisible hand had brushed against him. It was a suffocating, unbearable sensation. He glanced into the rearview mirror again, but the darkness seemed thicker than before, as if the cargo had merged with the night itself. He turned away, taking a deep breath, searching for some shred of sanity. But as he did, he noticed the radio had turned on by itself. Instead of static or music, he heard a labored, heavy breathing, each breath a warning. He was surrounded, trapped in that truck with something that knew him, something that had been watching him for far longer than he could comprehend. In the height of his terror, he slammed down the accelerator, the engine roaring as if it too wanted to escape. He didn't know where he was headed, but a primal instinct screamed within him that the only safe path was forward, to get as far away from that cursed cargo as possible. But deep down, he knew he couldn't run forever. Liam felt the air inside the cab growing denser, almost unbreathable. Fear mingled with exhaustion, leaving him on the brink of despair. With each mile covered, the sound of knocks and whispers seemed to grow stronger, invading his thoughts, corroding any trace of rationality. He no longer drove consciously. He just accelerated, trying to escape something that was following him very closely, and that perhaps would never let him go. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road. It was a man wearing a heavy jacket, his face obscured in the shadows. The stranger raised his hand, gesturing for him to stop. Liam felt a deep fear, but something inside him, perhaps a desperate attempt to seek help, made him hit the brakes, causing the wheels to screech and kick up dust on the asphalt. The figure approached slowly. When the man leaned toward the window, Liam noticed something disturbing. His face was partially covered in scars, with deep dark eyes as if he had seen unimaginable horrors. Liam tried to stay calm as he lowered the window, hoping to hear anything that might bring some sense of reality to that surreal night. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice hoarse and deep, as if each word carried the weight of a forgotten truth. Liam tried to ask who he was, but the man's voice interrupted him. "I know this load. I know what you're carrying," he said, casting a tense look toward the trailer. It doesn't belong to our world, and once you're carrying it, there's no turning back. Liam felt his heart pound, the truth of that phrase spreading in his mind like poison. "What do you mean by no turning back?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The man looked at him with a grim expression. "That thing back there, it will consume you, Liam. It wants more than a place to stay. It wants you." The moment the man said this, a loud bang echoed from inside the trailer, as if something were testing the walls, trying to breach the barrier that kept it locked inside. The man backed away, his eyes filled with terror. "Sorry, but you're on your own, kid." And without another word, he vanished into the darkness, leaving only the echo of his words. Liam sat in silence, processing what he had just heard. He knew with a terrifying certainty that the stranger was right. That thing, that presence in the trailer, wasn't something he could escape. It followed him like a shadow, like an extension of his own mind. He felt connected to it in a way that defied any logical understanding. Making an impulsive decision, he got out of the cab and walked to the trailer, his trembling hands gripping the door handle. With each step, he felt pressure building in his chest, a heavy energy forcing him to rethink what he was about to do. But he knew he could no longer ignore it. He had to confront whatever was in there. He gripped the handle firmly and in a swift motion opened the trailer door. The darkness seemed to swallow the headlights' glow, and all he saw was a deep void, like an abyss. And then something moved. A shadowy, indistinct form began to writhe in the depths of the trailer, as if it were waking, slowly emerging from the shadows. When his eyes focused on that darkness, Liam saw a pair of eyes, deep, hollow, full of hunger and hatred, staring at him with deadly intent. He took a step back, but felt his legs weaken. The presence in the trailer was much more than something physical. It was an entity that defied sanity itself, a creature that fed on fear, on despair. The trailer door closed on its own, and Liam found himself alone in the darkness of the road, with the cold wind lashing his face. The sound from the trailer continued to echo, like a pulsing heart, a beat that seemed synchronized with his own breathing. He knew he was marked, that the entity in the trailer would not let him go. In that instant, he knew the stranger was right. His fate was sealed. The world around Liam grew indistinct, like a nightmare where shapes and sounds no longer made sense. He stood at the edge of the road, alone, with the truck becoming an imposing and threatening presence beside him. The entity inside the trailer seemed to exude an energy that seeped through the metal walls, forming a dense fog that hovered around the truck. He knew he needed to leave, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if an invisible weight pinned him to the ground, forcing him to face the trailer, to confront whatever awaited him in the darkness. The trailer door creaked slowly, as if something inside was pressing against the metal, trying to open a gap between itself and the outside world. "Liam," a voice echoed, coming from somewhere between the physical and the supernatural, cold and piercing. It was not just any voice, it was a summons, an irresistible call that filled him with a mixture of terror and fascination. He realized the voice didn't come from outside. It was in his mind whispering, insinuating itself into every corner of his consciousness, breaking down any remnants of willpower he still possessed. His legs began to move, almost as if guided by an unseen force. He approached the trailer with slow steps, each accompanied by a muffled sound, like the beating of a distant drum. The air around was cold, dense, sharp as a blade. Somewhere deep in his mind, Liam knew he shouldn't open that door again, but something stronger compelled him, a force he couldn't resist. He reached out and touched the door handle, feeling the cold metal against his skin. With an almost automatic motion, he pulled the handle, and the door swung open all at once, revealing a deep darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the headlights' light. From within the trailer, a figure began to form, indistinct and wavering, like a shadow made of dense fog. Liam tried to look away, but he was trapped by that vision. It was a human-like presence, yet at the same time it was not. The face, or what seemed to be a face, was deformed, twisted, a mask of despair and hatred, eyes empty like endless abysses. And even without words, Liam understood that the entity had been with him since the beginning of the journey, absorbing every drop of fear, of anxiety, growing and feeding. The figure moved slowly toward him, stopping just a step away. Liam no longer felt the ground beneath his feet. It was as if time and space had ceased to exist. All that remained was that frozen moment of pure terror. He tried to step back, but he was trapped. The shadows around him seemed to solidify, holding him tightly like invisible claws. The figure raised an arm, and Liam felt a crushing pressure in his chest, as if he were being pulled into the void. His body remained motionless, frozen by fear and the entity's control. He felt the presence invade his thoughts, like poison spreading through his veins. The entity didn't just want his life, it wanted his mind, his soul. A macabre fusion that would make it impossible to tell where he ended and it began. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped, swallowed by the abyss that surrounded him. The entity leaned closer, its distorted face only inches from his own. The creature's lips parted, revealing a sinister, cold and hungry smile. "Liam, you are now part of me," the entity whispered, its voice blending with Liam's own, as if they were already one. With one last effort, he closed his eyes, feeling his body lose strength, as if he were fading. When he opened his eyes again, the void surrounded him completely. He was in the trailer, alone, enveloped in the same darkness that had once threatened him from the outside. He looked around, feeling like a prisoner, and heard a familiar, muffled sound, the sound of knocks on the trailer door. Now, Liam was part of the cargo,